Welcome to Moonlight Audiobook, where shadows hold secrets and every word carries intrigue. As we step into tonight's mystery with Hercule Poirot, Evil Under the Sun. I'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Share it in the comments below as we begin our journey into suspense. Chapter 1A: Summer's Deception. It was on a golden August morning that the Jolly Roger Hotel opened its shutters wide to the sea. Perched high above the rugged cliffs of Leathercombe Bay, the hotel looked out across waters that shimmered in deceptive tranquility. Guests lounged on deck chairs upon the terrace, parasols sprouted like bright blossoms, and laughter carried lightly on the salt-sweet air. It was, by all outward appearances, a paradise of leisure. And yet, beneath the polished silver teapots and the crisp linen of the dining tables, beneath the clinking of ice in tall glasses and the languid conversations, there lingered something less harmonious. For among the guests gathered at the Jolly Roger that season, there was envy, resentment, and the careful concealment of things never meant to see daylight. The place itself had become a theatre where vanity and desire played their parts. The well-to-do who came here wished to be seen, admired, and envied. In such a setting, appearances meant everything, and appearances, as often proved true, could be most misleading. At the very center of this glittering assembly was a woman who seemed to outshine them all. Arlena Stuart Marshall, once a celebrated actress of the London stage, was as radiant as the sun overhead. Tall, striking, with flame-red hair that drew the eye like a flare, she walked through the hotel gardens as though upon a stage, every movement designed to be observed. Wherever she went, whispers followed. She was admired, envied, and, though few would admit it aloud, resented. Her husband, Captain Kenneth Marshall, was a quieter presence, his bronzed face impassive, his manner reserved. To some, his silence seemed dignity; to others, it suggested an uncomfortable restraint, as though he had grown weary of standing in his wife's dazzling shadow. His young daughter, Linda, pale and awkward, trailed uncertainly in her stepmother's wake, a shadow eclipsed entirely by that bright flame. The guests at the Jolly Roger knew well enough that Arlena thrived on admiration, and that admiration, more often than not, came from the husbands of other women. Among them was Patrick Redfern, a man of easy charm and athletic good looks, whose attentions to Arlena were far from discreet. His wife, Christine, quiet and self-effacing, watched their flirtation with a strained composure that did not wholly conceal the pain beneath. Lady Horbury, elegant in silks though a little frayed at the edges, observed from behind her cigarette holder, her sharp tongue quick to strike when jealousy pricked. Major Barry, red-faced and blustering, was heard to mutter that such women come to no good end. Reverend Lane, gentle and mild, sought to bring a note of civility, though few listened when his sermons extended beyond the breakfast table. It was a closed circle, as hotel life so often is. The same faces at every meal, the same encounters along the sunlit paths, the same gossip whispered from veranda to veranda. Everyone knew, or thought they knew, everyone else's business. And yet, as always, there were secrets that went unspoken. On that morning, the air was still, almost heavy, as though the sea itself held its breath. Arlena, dressed in a white bathing suit that gleamed against her tanned skin, announced her intention of bathing alone at a secluded cove. She moved off with a careless laugh, her figure cutting a brilliant silhouette against the rocky path. A few eyes followed her, a few lips curled in disdain. Her departure seemed ordinary enough, yet it was destined to be remembered with dreadful clarity. For by midday, when the sun blazed its fiercest, the idyllic calm of Leathercombe Bay would be shattered. Voices would cry out in horror. The cove where Arlena had gone to swim would yield not a vision of beauty but of tragedy. She would be found lifeless upon the sun-warmed sands, her once laughing eyes closed forever. Before the horror broke, however, the hotel guests carried on in their ordinary pursuits, unaware that the hours of leisure were numbered. They gathered in the lounge for coffee, strolled along the terrace, exchanged trivialities, yet every triviality was colored, in hindsight, with significance. Each word spoken, each glance exchanged, was a thread in the unseen web that was already tightening. Some remarked on Kenneth Marshall's silence, noting how his gaze followed his wife and her admirer. Others whispered about Christine Redfern's pallor, her fragile hands twisting a book she scarcely read. Lady Horbury, watching it all with narrowed eyes, exhaled her smoke like a dragon awaiting fire. Major Barry grumbled at the impropriety of it, though his indignation was tinged with relish at having something to discuss. And then there was the small, precise figure who observed them all with eyes at once keen and amused. Hercule Poirot, retired but never truly idle, sat contentedly upon the terrace in his immaculate white suit, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his moustaches stiff with perfection. He sipped his chocolate with evident satisfaction, but his gaze wandered ceaselessly across the scene before him. Nothing escaped those eyes, not the flicker of annoyance upon one face nor the flash of triumph upon another. To the casual onlooker, he seemed a dapper little man enjoying his holiday. To those who knew him better, he was a mind forever alert, forever cataloguing, forever noting the order and disorder of human conduct. And already, though he had not yet stirred from his chair, Poirot was aware that beneath the bright sun of Leathercombe Bay, darker shadows moved. The sea sparkled, the gulls wheeled, laughter drifted across the terrace. But time, implacable and indifferent, moved inexorably towards the hour when the holiday gaiety would end, and a crime most cruel would thrust itself into the heart of paradise. And when that hour struck, it would be to Hercule Poirot, the little Belgian with the famous moustaches, that every eye would turn. For it is under the most radiant sun that the darkest evil may flourish. Chapter 2: Whispers at the Clifftop Hotel. The discovery broke like a thunderclap over the bright, untroubled morning. Arlena Marshall's body had been found sprawled upon the sand of the secluded cove, her skin gleaming against the rocks, her hair a vivid banner against the pale shore. The laughter of the gulls above seemed indecent, the brilliance of the sunlight cruelly out of place. Within minutes, the quiet order of the hotel dissolved into confusion. A chambermaid ran shrieking for help, her cries carrying to the terrace, where chairs scraped back and conversations broke abruptly. The guests, drawn as if by dreadful magnetism, clustered together in groups, eyes wide, voices pitched with shock. The hotel manager, Mr. Lane, perspiring freely, attempted to restore calm, but it was Hercule Poirot who rose, serene and measured, and declared that the authorities must be summoned at once. His composure, his unfailing order, lent the moment a strange gravity. Though not yet in any official capacity, Poirot's presence alone suggested that the chaos might, in time, be resolved. By the time Inspector Colgate of the local constabulary arrived, the guests had been gathered in the lounge, shutters drawn against the blazing sun as though to shut out its merciless glare. The room was heavy with perfume, tobacco smoke, and suppressed voices. It was here that the closed circle of suspects began to take shape, each unwillingly bound together by the tragedy that had unfolded. Kenneth Marshall stood apart from the rest, his jaw set, his bronzed face drawn yet expressionless. He refused the comfort of those who sought to speak to him, replying in curt monosyllables. His eyes, grey and unreadable, betrayed neither grief nor anger, and it was this very composure that caused some to murmur uneasily. A man so calm, they thought, must surely be hiding more than he showed. Near him, young Linda Marshall sat pale and trembling, her hands twisting the hem of her skirt. She avoided every gaze, shrinking further into herself. Though scarcely more than a girl, her dislike of her glamorous stepmother had been no secret. And now, her silence seemed weighted with something darker. Was it fear or guilt? Patrick Redfern shifted uneasily in his chair, his sun-browned face betraying agitation. His easy charm, so apparent before, had evaporated. He had been seen with Arlena on more than one occasion, his admiration all too public. His wife, Christine, sat stiffly beside him, her eyes fixed on the floor, her face drained of color. If jealousy had burned within her, it was now hidden behind a mask of composure too rigid to be wholly natural. Lady Horbury, elegant though trembling, raised her cigarette to lips that quivered despite her efforts. She whispered sharp comments to Major Barry, who responded with bluster, his ruddy face flushed with more than indignation. Both seemed to take a certain relish in recounting details of the discovery, though their voices carried an undercurrent of unease. Reverend Lane, seated with clasped hands, muttered prayers beneath his breath, casting glances heavenward. His gentle face, however, betrayed not only sorrow but a certain anxiety, as though his conscience was burdened by something left unsaid. Mrs. Castle, a guest of quieter habits, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, lamenting the wickedness of the world. Others sat in tense silence, their eyes darting between one another, as though fearing that to speak might betray more than they intended. Inspector Colgate began his task in a methodical manner, asking each guest to recount where they had been during the critical hours of the morning. His questions were direct, but his manner lacked finesse. He noted times, places, and movements, piecing together a rudimentary account of the day's events. Yet it was Poirot who observed more than the words. He noted the tremor in Christine Redfern's hands as she adjusted her spectacles, the faintly sardonic curl of Lady Horbury's mouth when she denied jealousy, the sudden tightening of Kenneth Marshall's jaw when his wife's name was spoken. To the inspector, these were trivialities. To Poirot, they were the very essence of human psychology, the betrayals of the unconscious. As each guest spoke, the contradictions grew. Several claimed to have seen Arlena walking alone toward the cove. Others placed Patrick Redfern nearby, though his own account was vague. Christine insisted she had been sketching upon the terrace, but her sketchbook, when produced, bore only hesitant outlines, as though completed in haste. Kenneth claimed to have been writing letters in his room, yet no one recalled seeing him there. Linda, pressed for her whereabouts, stammered incoherently, unable to give a coherent account. The inspector dutifully recorded these statements, satisfied that he could sort truth from error later. But Poirot, with his fingertips pressed together, his head slightly inclined, already perceived that the truth was not to be found in words alone. It lay in what was avoided, in what was too readily asserted, and in what the human heart, however carefully guarded, could not conceal. At length, Colgate declared that none might leave the hotel until further notice. The guests accepted this with varying degrees of reluctance. Some protested, some wept, some merely nodded in grim resignation. And thus the closed circle was drawn, every man and woman bound together in suspicion. That evening, as the sun sank behind the cliffs and the sea darkened to indigo, Poirot took his solitary walk along the terrace. He paused often, gazing out across the restless waters, his mind moving with quiet precision. Already he had observed much. The dead woman had been admired and resented in equal measure. She had brought desire, jealousy, and humiliation in her wake. In such a field, motives sprouted like weeds, abundant and entangled. And yet, he reminded himself, not all motives were equal. Vanity, greed, passion, yes, these were visible. But behind them, perhaps, lay something deeper, something hidden. For murder, Poirot knew, is rarely the simple fruit of one emotion. It is the final flowering of many, nourished in darkness. As the first stars pricked the evening sky, Poirot turned back toward the lounge where the guests sat in uneasy companionship. Their faces, in lamplight, seemed masks, each concealing secrets, each waiting to be read. He smiled faintly, a smile of both pity and satisfaction. Yes, he murmured softly to himself, already the little grey cells are awake. Soon, très bientôt, we shall bring order from this confusion. And with that, he rejoined the gathering, the small, dapper figure who alone among them was untroubled. for while they trembled in suspicion and fear, Hercule Poirot welcomed the challenge. In the darkness under the sun, it was his gift to see with perfect clarity. Chapter 3: The Shadow on the Terrace. The lounge of the Jolly Roger Hotel had grown heavy with silence. The shutters remained drawn against the blazing sun, and the air, thick with smoke and tension, carried every cough, every sigh, every whispered remark. It was here that Hercule Poirot began his first interviews. He did not storm into them as the inspector had done, nor press his questions with the bluntness of authority. Instead, he moved with his characteristic grace and courtesy, inviting rather than demanding, listening more than speaking. It was Kenneth Marshall whom he spoke to first. The widower sat with arms folded across his chest, his face bronzed and stern, his composure seemingly unbreakable. Poirot addressed him with quiet respect, acknowledging his grief before asking, very gently, of his mourning. Marshall replied in his clipped manner. He had been writing letters in his room from 10:30 until the call came about his wife. His tone was matter-of-fact, as though he were giving a military report. Poirot inclined his head, but his eyes studied the man's rigid posture, the way his lips tightened when Arlena's name was spoken. Here was a man accustomed to discipline, to silence, and perhaps, to concealment. Poirot noted one detail in particular. Marshall had said, "My wife is dead," with no tremor of the voice. Not Arlena, not she, but my wife, a formality that placed distance between himself and the woman whose life had ended so violently. Poirot filed it away in the careful compartments of his mind. From Kenneth, Poirot turned to Linda, the awkward young girl who sat hunched in her chair like a guilty schoolchild. Her eyes darted nervously, her hands picked at her skirt, and her voice, when she spoke, was thin and wavering. She said she had been wandering near the cliff paths, alone. She could not say quite when she had gone out nor when she had returned. Poirot, watching her closely, saw the flush creep into her cheeks and the sudden tremble in her voice. It was not merely grief that troubled her, no, it was something sharper, resentment, perhaps even hatred. The girl's feelings toward her stepmother had been no secret. Poirot wondered, was this merely the cruel confusion of adolescence, or was it something more dangerous? Christine Redfern was next, pale and fragile in her chair, her husband at her side. She told Poirot in soft tones that she had been sketching on the terrace that morning, seeking the quiet her soul required. Poirot asked if anyone had seen her. She hesitated, then admitted she had been mostly alone. Her sketchbook, offered as proof, bore only faint and incomplete outlines, as though her hand had not been steady. Her husband, Patrick, interjected quickly, declaring that he had seen Arlena walking toward the cove and had thought no harm in it. His manner was a touch too eager, his voice raised in self-justification. Poirot noted the tension between them, the wife fragile and quiet, the husband restless and defiant. And always, in Patrick's eyes, that spark of admiration when Arlena's name was spoken. Lady Horbury, cigarette in hand, leaned back with weary elegance when her turn came. She professed horror at the crime, though her words dripped with a faint satisfaction, as though she had long predicted that such a woman would meet such an end. She insisted that she had been in her room writing letters. Poirot bowed politely, but he observed the quickness with which she dismissed questions of jealousy, and the way her manicured fingers tapped restlessly against her glass. Her disdain was genuine, but disdain, Poirot knew, could mask many shades of emotion. Major Barry blustered through his interview, declaring in no uncertain terms that women of that sort courted disaster. He claimed to have been bathing at the main beach at the time. His manner was full of indignation, his face red with moral outrage. Yet Poirot, who had seen such men before, wondered how much of his indignation was genuine, and how much a convenient cloak for curiosity and envy. Reverend Lane, when questioned, folded his hands with clerical composure. He had been reading his Bible in the garden, he said, when the commotion began. His voice was steady, his eyes earnest. And yet Poirot detected beneath the mild exterior a restlessness, a glance too quick, as though the good Reverend were anxious not to be pressed too closely. So the interviews proceeded, each giving their accounts, each swearing their innocence. To Inspector Colgate, it seemed no more than a matter of verifying alibis, of fitting times and places into a simple pattern. But Poirot, in his quiet way, was assembling something more subtle, not a chart of movements, but a map of human emotion. By the end of the afternoon, the picture was already forming. Arlena had been a woman who provoked strong passions, admiration, desire, jealousy, hatred. Each of those passions had burned brightly among the guests of the Jolly Roger. Each guest, Poirot reflected, had reason to wish her silenced. And yet, it was one account in particular that stood out. Patrick Redfern's eagerness to assert that he had seen Arlena heading to the cove rang oddly in Poirot's ears. It was too quick, too insistent, as though rehearsed. And Christine's sketchbook, with its feeble, half-drawn lines, seemed less a pastime of the morning than an alibi constructed in haste. To the inspector, it was simple. The husband, the jealous wife, or the reckless admirer, one of them must have done it. Already Colgate leaned toward Kenneth Marshall, the cold, silent man whose composure seemed unnatural. But Poirot, smoothing his moustaches with delicate care, murmured to himself, "Non, mon cher inspector. It is too soon, far too soon. Appearances, they are like the sea at noon, glittering, dazzling, but treacherous beneath. One must look deeper, always deeper." He closed his notebook with satisfaction. Already, the first false lead had appeared, as it always did. And already, Hercule Poirot had seen past it. The lounge of the Jolly Roger Hotel had grown heavy with silence. The shutters remained drawn against the blazing sun, and the air, thick with smoke and tension, carried every cough, every sigh, every whispered remark. It was here that Hercule Poirot began his first interviews. He did not storm into them as the inspector had done, nor press his questions with the bluntness of authority. Instead, he moved with his characteristic grace and courtesy, inviting rather than demanding, listening more than speaking. It was Kenneth Marshall whom he spoke to first. The widower sat with arms folded across his chest, his face bronzed and stern, his composure seemingly unbreakable. Poirot addressed him with quiet respect, acknowledging his grief before asking, very gently, of his mourning. Marshall replied in his clipped manner. He had been writing letters in his room from 10:30 until the call came about his wife. His tone was matter-of-fact, as though he were giving a military report. Poirot inclined his head, but his eyes studied the man's rigid posture, the way his lips tightened when Arlena's name was spoken. Here was a man accustomed to discipline, to silence, and perhaps, to concealment. Poirot noted one detail in particular. Marshall had said, "My wife is dead," with no tremor of the voice. Not Arlena, not she, but my wife, a formality that placed distance between himself and the woman whose life had ended so violently. Poirot filed it away in the careful compartments of his mind. From Kenneth, Poirot turned to Linda, the awkward young girl who sat hunched in her chair like a guilty schoolchild. Her eyes darted nervously, her hands picked at her skirt, and her voice, when she spoke, was thin and wavering. She said she had been wandering near the cliff paths, alone. She could not say quite when she had gone out nor when she had returned. Poirot, watching her closely, saw the flush creep into her cheeks and the sudden tremble in her voice. It was not merely grief that troubled her, no, it was something sharper, resentment, perhaps even hatred. The girl's feelings toward her stepmother had been no secret. Poirot wondered, was this merely the cruel confusion of adolescence, or was it something more dangerous? Christine Redfern was next, pale and fragile in her chair, her husband at her side. She told Poirot in soft tones that she had been sketching on the terrace that morning, seeking the quiet her soul required. Poirot asked if anyone had seen her. She hesitated, then admitted she had been mostly alone. Her sketchbook, offered as proof, bore only faint and incomplete outlines, as though her hand had not been steady. Her husband, Patrick, interjected quickly, declaring that he had seen Arlena walking toward the cove and had thought no harm in it. His manner was a touch too eager, his voice raised in self-justification. Poirot noted the tension between them, the wife fragile and quiet, the husband restless and defiant. And always, in Patrick's eyes, that spark of admiration when Arlena's name was spoken. Lady Horbury, cigarette in hand, leaned back with weary elegance when her turn came. She professed horror at the crime, though her words dripped with a faint satisfaction, as though she had long predicted that such a woman would meet such an end. She insisted that she had been in her room writing letters. Poirot bowed politely, but he observed the quickness with which she dismissed questions of jealousy and the way her manicured fingers tapped restlessly against her glass. Her disdain was genuine, but disdain, Poirot knew, could mask many shades of emotion. Major Barry blustered through his interview, declaring in no uncertain terms that women of that sort courted disaster. He claimed to have been bathing at the main beach at the time. His manner was full of indignation, his face red with moral outrage. Yet Poirot, who had seen such men before, wondered how much of his indignation was genuine, and how much a convenient cloak for curiosity and envy. Reverend Lane, when questioned, folded his hands with clerical composure. He had been reading his Bible in the garden, he said, when the commotion began. His voice was steady, his eyes earnest. And yet Poirot detected beneath the mild exterior a restlessness, a glance too quick, as though the good reverend were anxious not to be pressed too closely. So the interviews proceeded, each giving their accounts, each swearing their innocence. To Inspector Colgate, it seemed no more than a matter of verifying alibis, of fitting times and places into a simple pattern. But Poirot, in his quiet way, was assembling something more subtle, not a chart of movements, but a map of human emotion. By the end of the afternoon, the picture was already forming. Arlena had been a woman who provoked strong passions, admiration, desire, jealousy, hatred. Each of those passions had burned brightly among the guests of the Jolly Roger. Each guest, Poirot reflected, had reason to wish her silenced. And yet, it was one account in particular that stood out. Patrick Redfern's eagerness to assert that he had seen Arlena heading to the cove rang oddly in Poirot's ears. It was too quick, too insistent, as though rehearsed. And Christine's sketchbook, with its feeble, half-drawn lines, seemed less a pastime of the morning than an alibi constructed in haste. To the inspector, it was simple. The husband, the jealous wife, or the reckless admirer, one of them must have done it. Already Colgate leaned toward Kenneth Marshall, the cold, silent man whose composure seemed unnatural. But Poirot, smoothing his moustaches with delicate care, murmured to himself, "Non, mon cher inspector. It is too soon, far too soon. Appearances, they are like the sea at noon, glittering, dazzling, but treacherous beneath. One must look deeper, always deeper." He closed his notebook with satisfaction. Already, the first false lead had appeared, as it always did. And already, Hercule Poirot had seen past it. Chapter 4: Murder in the Sunlight. Inspector Colgate had the manner of a man satisfied with progress. By the second evening of the investigation, his notes were neatly aligned, his theory clear. He stood in the lounge before the assembled guests, his notebook in hand, and declared in his firm provincial voice that the inquiry was advancing in a very definite direction. The guests, gathered uneasily in the lamplight, leaned forward. Lady Horbury exhaled smoke in a dramatic plume. Major Barry harumphed as though anticipating vindication. Christine Redfern's pale hands clenched in her lap, while Patrick shifted uncomfortably beside her. All eyes turned upon Kenneth Marshall. For it was Kenneth whom the inspector had fixed upon with growing certainty. The reasoning was straightforward. the husband had both proximity and motive. He had been in his room at the time of the crime, so he claimed, but no one had seen him there. His silence, his composure, his refusal to display grief seemed unnatural, almost incriminating. And, Colgate reminded them, it was often the husband who found the burden of a flirtatious wife intolerable. Kenneth listened in silence, his expression unchanging. Only a tightening of the jaw betrayed his inner tension. When Colgate suggested that jealousy, humiliation, or the desire for peace might have driven him to the act, he replied in a flat voice, "I had no wish to harm her. My wife lived her life as she chose. I accepted it." The words, so devoid of passion, only confirmed Colgate's suspicion. To him, the restraint was not stoicism but guilt. The guests murmured among themselves. Lady Horbury whispered audibly to Major Barry that she had always said a man could only bear so much. The Major, red-faced, nodded vigorously. Christine Redfern avoided Kenneth's eyes, while Patrick studied his shoes. Linda Marshall shrank further into her chair, as though each word spoken pressed her down. Poirot, seated quietly in his immaculate white suit, listened without interruption. His eyes, alert and penetrating, moved from one face to another, noting the play of expression. He heard the inspector's reasoning, the murmurs of agreement, the subtle relief on certain faces that suspicion had shifted elsewhere. And then, when silence fell, he stirred at last. "Permit me, Inspector," he said with delicate courtesy, "to observe a little." Colgate frowned slightly but inclined his head. Poirot rose, joining his fingertips together in his familiar gesture. "You suggest, monsieur, that Monsieur Marshall is guilty because he is calm, because he is, how do you say, without emotion. But is it always so? There are men who grieve noisily, who beat the breast and cry to heaven. There are men who grieve in silence, who lock their hearts as though behind a door. Which is the more sincere? One cannot say." He paused, his eyes resting on Kenneth, who remained motionless. Poirot continued. "Further, we must consider opportunity. Yes, Monsieur Marshall was in his room, unobserved. But also, Madame Redfern was sketching, unobserved. Monsieur Redfern was strolling, unobserved. Even Lady Horbury, even Major Barry, even the good Reverend, all had their moments without witness. To point to the husband alone, that is to ignore that others too walked in the shadow." There was a stir at this, uneasy glances exchanged. Poirot, with a faint smile, resumed his seat. The inspector, somewhat ruffled, muttered that of course all possibilities were being examined, but the husband is the most likely. Poirot inclined his head, as though conceding the point, but in his eyes was a light of certainty. To him, the husband's silence was not guilt but something else, pride, perhaps, or discipline. Poirot's little grey cells told him that Kenneth Marshall was not a man to kill in passion. His restraint was too deeply ingrained, too much a part of his nature. Later, walking the terrace alone, Poirot reflected on what he had seen. The eagerness with which the guests accepted suspicion of Kenneth was telling. It suited them that the matter should be so simple. It excused them from further fear. And yet, that eagerness itself betrayed unease. For each, in the secrecy of conscience, knew there was reason for suspicion nearer home. Poirot thought of Christine Redfern, pale and trembling, whose sketchbook bore no true record of her mourning. He thought of Patrick, too ready with his declaration of having seen Arlena walking to the cove. He thought of Linda, consumed with resentment toward her stepmother, her words halting, her eyes afraid. And Lady Horbury, who spoke of Arlena's downfall with such relish, as though it confirmed her own bitter prophecies. All were possible. All were human. And in humanity, Poirot trusted more than in alibis or the ticking of clocks. As the waves below crashed softly against the rocks, Poirot murmured to himself, "The inspector, he looks for the solution that is convenient. But murder, it is not convenient. It is messy, it is tangled, it is, how do you say, illogical in its appearance, but always logical in its heart. We must seek not what is easy, but what is true. When he returned indoors, the guests were dispersing. Lady Horbury retired with a toss of the head, Major Barry puffing indignantly at her side. Reverend Lane walked with bowed head, murmuring to himself. Kenneth remained silent, aloof, his daughter clinging to his arm. Christine passed like a ghost, her husband's hand resting on her elbow, guiding her firmly away. Poirot watched them go, his eyes thoughtful. One detail, small but telling, struck him then. Christine's step faltered when Patrick touched her, as though even his touch were unwelcome. And Patrick, noticing, pressed his hand the more firmly, his jaw set. A husband's gesture, yes, but also, Poirot thought, the gesture of a man afraid of losing control. It was a detail the inspector had not seen, nor cared to. But to Poirot, it was one more piece in the delicate mosaic of human behavior. The false lead had taken shape, suspicion of the husband, a theory neat and convenient. The inspector would pursue it eagerly. But Poirot, with the patience of his little grey cells, already looked elsewhere. For he knew, as surely as the sea would rise with the moon, that the truth lay hidden where no one yet cared to look. Chapter 5. A Circle of Secrets. The investigation had, by this time, gathered momentum, though not always in the direction that Poirot considered wise. Superintendent Hadley, diligent but lacking finesse, had begun to align his suspicions with the evidence that seemed most visible, tangible clues that glittered like fool's gold. Among these was a most damning discovery. In the drawer of Major Redfern's room lay a torn scrap of paper, upon which was written in bold, hurried script the phrase, "She will regret it before the sun sets." It had evidently been ripped from a larger sheet, but the implication was obvious enough. Here was a direct threat, penned by a man known to have quarrelled bitterly with Alina the day before her death. Witnesses had overheard sharp words between them near the tennis courts, and Major Redfern, though habitually taciturn, had flushed with unmistakable rage when she taunted him. Hadley, almost triumphant, laid out the sequence. A quarrel between lovers, a rash threat, and then, mere hours later, the discovery of the woman strangled upon the sands. The circumstantial line appeared neat, even elegant in its symmetry. Too neat, perhaps. Poirot listened in silence, his fingertips pressed lightly together, his gaze resting upon the superintendent's earnest face. When the recital concluded, he inclined his head gravely. "It is very pretty, mon ami," he murmured. "A perfect circle, so round, so smooth. But beware, for sometimes it is the perfection itself that betrays the hand of design." Hadley frowned. "You think it too simple, Poirot?" "Mais oui. Life, she is untidy, full of irregularities. Yet here, all the lines are drawn as by compass. It is as though someone has said, let us give to the police a puzzle that they can solve without straining themselves." The Major himself, when confronted, proved bewildered rather than defiant. He admitted the quarrel. Alina had a tongue that could cut deep, but denied ever writing the note. He claimed the handwriting was unlike his own, a point that, to Poirot's eyes, seemed true enough. Still, the presence of the paper in his drawer was not so easily explained. Redfern suggested, awkwardly, that anyone might have had access to his room, the locks being old and the chambermaid inattentive. Poirot observed him closely throughout. The man's discomfort was genuine, yet not necessarily the discomfort of guilt. Rather, it seemed the unease of one who feels the trap closing around him without comprehending the mechanism. His shoulders hunched as if awaiting a blow, his voice low and halting, lacking the defiance that a guilty man might feign. Meanwhile, whispers spread among the hotel guests. Mrs. Redfern, pale and silent, endured the veiled glances of others, knowing that her husband's intimacy with Alina had been common gossip. Rosamond Darnley, too, seemed restless. Poirot noticed her often seated apart, her eyes fixed upon the sea, her hands twisting together as though in torment. The atmosphere within the hotel grew taut with suspicion, each guest retreating behind polite barriers yet secretly speculating. The once idyllic retreat had transformed into a stage upon which fear and doubt performed their silent drama. Poirot, however, remained calm. He sat on the terrace in the golden light of evening, watching the sun sink behind the cliffs. The false leads, they are the weeds in the garden of truth, he reflected aloud. They must be plucked one by one, until only the rare flower remains. Hadley, still convinced of Redfern's guilt, pressed for his arrest. Poirot raised a delicate hand. "No, my friend. To seize upon the obvious is to grasp at the shadow while the substance escapes. Let us wait, only a little. The sun, she casts long shadows, but in the end she reveals." And in his private thoughts, Poirot smiled very slightly. For though he would not yet declare it, he had already perceived a tiny crack in the smooth facade of the case, a contradiction so slight that others overlooked it. It was not yet the time to speak, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and from it, the truth would grow. Chapter 6. The Little Grey Cells Awaken. Poirot's method, though often misunderstood by the unimaginative, was never one of brute pursuit. He did not storm the fortress of truth. Rather, he laid siege with patience and subtlety, allowing its gates to open of their own accord. To the casual observer, his days at the resort might have appeared almost idle. He strolled along the terrace, admired the roses in the garden, lingered over delicate meals, and partook in trivial conversation. Yet beneath this appearance of leisure, he was conducting an experiment most exact, the study of human nature under pressure. It was in the drawing-room after luncheon that he began his little campaign. The guests had assembled, the storm of rumor still hanging heavily in the air. Poirot, seated in an armchair with the sunlight glinting on his patent leather shoes, spoke with deceptive casualness. "It is curious, is it not," he mused aloud, "how the smallest detail, overlooked by all, can sometimes be of the most profound significance." His words fell into the quiet room like stones into still water. Several heads turned toward him. Mrs. Redfern, seated near the piano, started slightly and bent lower over her embroidery. Rosamond Darnley, elegant in pale linen, glanced up sharply before resuming her calm demeanor. Major Redfern, uneasy, shifted in his chair. Poirot smiled gently, as though he had made only a harmless observation. "For example," he continued, "the matter of time. Ah! Time is the slyest of deceivers. A few minutes, they may seem nothing, and yet, they may conceal everything." He allowed the remark to dangle, watching each face in turn. He saw Major Redfern swallow hard, his eyes darting briefly toward his wife. He noticed Rosamond's hands stilling on the arm of her chair. Even Mrs. Castle, the voluble matron, leaned forward with sudden curiosity. Poirot then turned to another subject with apparent whimsy, discussing the excellence of Devonshire cream and the vagaries of English weather. Yet the seed had been planted, and he observed how the silence afterward grew uneasy. Those who had nothing to conceal remained serene, those who harbored secrets betrayed them in minute gestures, the betrayals of the subconscious. Later, upon the terrace, he approached Mrs. Redfern. She had been gazing out at the sea, her face pale, her eyes troubled. With the utmost delicacy, Poirot engaged her in conversation. "Madam," he said softly, "it is hard, is it not, to stand beneath the eyes of others when suspicion falls?" She gave a nervous laugh. I suppose people must talk. They always do." Poirot inclined his head. "Courage, madam. Truth, she is often cruel in her unveiling, but in the end she is liberating." Her eyes filled with sudden tears. "I only want to be left in peace," she whispered. Poirot bowed slightly, leaving her with dignity intact, but he filed the moment away. Here was a woman who knew more than she dared reveal, a soul torn between loyalty and suffering. Rosamond Darnley, too, came under his quiet scrutiny. In the cool shade of the garden, he remarked lightly upon the beauty of the setting. She smiled, but her composure was brittle. When he mentioned Arlena's name, her eyes hardened, just for an instant. Poirot caught it. A fleeting shadow, yet eloquent. "You admired her, mademoiselle?" he asked gently. Rosamond hesitated. "Arlena was remarkable," she said at last. The pause before the word betrayed her true feeling. Admiration was not what lay in her heart. Envy, perhaps. Or resentment. Thus, with questions that were not questions, with remarks that seemed idle, Poirot pressed gently upon the concealed motives of each. The Major's restlessness, his wife's pain, Rosamond's jealousy, all came into sharper relief. Yet he did not pounce, he merely watched, listened, and allowed the contradictions to accumulate. When evening came, Poirot sat once more by the window of his room, gazing at the dying light upon the water. He reflected, as he often did, in silence. They play their parts well, these people, he thought. Each has rehearsed the mask that conceals the truth. But the mask, it slips when one least expects. A flicker of the eye, a trembling of the hand, a hesitation of speech, voila! The soul, she peeps out, despite herself. And then, softly, he added, "We are moving closer." The noose, she tightens, but not yet around the neck that is guilty. Patience, Hercule Poirot. Patience. Chapter 7. Suspicions by Moonlight. On the following morning, the little resort wore its mask of tranquility. The gulls cried above the cliffs, the sea shimmered with innocent brilliance, and the guests, in their summer attire, carried on with their routines as though murder were an alien intrusion. Yet beneath the polite greetings and casual laughter, there was tension, a sense that each person feared the next inquiry, the next suspicion. Poirot, immaculate in a cream suit and hat, made his progress through the gardens as though he were merely admiring the roses. But his mind was engaged upon a more exacting beauty, the symmetry of truth. He had reached the stage where all appearances must be tested, each statement balanced against the unyielding measure of time. He began, as always, with the facts. Arlena had been seen alive at 11 o'clock, walking toward the cove. By midday, she was dead. Within that hour lay the key, and upon the movements of each person the case must stand or fall. He gathered the guests, under the pretext of clarifying the chronology, and invited them to recount once more their whereabouts. Major Redfern, upright and tense, declared that he had been in the bathing cove with his wife. Poirot noted the rigidity of his tone, as though he recited from a rehearsed script. Christine Redfern corroborated, though her voice faltered slightly when pressed for details. Rosamond Darnley, calm and polished, spoke of sketching in the shade. She smiled lightly, but Poirot observed the careful precision with which she described her position. Too precise, perhaps. Those who truly recall events often do so with natural vagueness. Those who invent must fix each point with exactness. Mrs. Castle and other guests offered their small recollections, trivial sightings, fragments of memory, but in Poirot's mind, the picture remained incomplete. "You see, Mesdames et Messieurs," he said at last, spreading his hands, "the alibi, she is like the fortress. Each man builds his walls of time and place, so high, so strong, to say, I could not have done it. But," he leaned forward, his eyes alight, "there is always the little crack in the stone, the weakness in the mortar. And through it, the truth, she escapes." He asked them, one by one, to recall not only where they had been but whom they had seen, and precisely when. As the accounts overlapped, contradictions emerged, small at first, but telling. Christine Redfern, pale, mentioned that she had lost sight of her husband for a few minutes while adjusting her parasol. Major Redfern, however, insisted he had remained beside her continuously. Poirot registered the discrepancy with a slight incline of his head. Rosamond claimed she had been alone, but another guest recollected passing her near the path to the cove at a time she had not mentioned. Again, a crack in the fortress. The alibis, meant to protect, had begun to ensnare their makers. Each contradiction was a thread, and Poirot, with infinite patience, began weaving them into a net. When the gathering dispersed, Poirot remained seated, gazing after them with an expression of mild amusement. To the casual eye, he seemed simply a foreign gentleman enjoying the sunshine. But within, his mind was exact as clockwork. Yes, he murmured softly. They struggle, they contradict, they explain too much or too little. Always, it is the same. The alibi, she is the most dangerous refuge. For the innocent, she stands firm. For the guilty, she crumbles under the weight of her own invention. And then he smiled, a smile not of triumph but of anticipation. The time approaches, mon ami. Soon, the mask, she will fall. Chapter 8, A Web of Contradictions. If the fortress of alibis had begun to show cracks, the matter of motive remained the true battleground. Hercule Poirot knew well that men and women might account cleverly for their movements, but it was desire, resentment, and fear that betrayed them in the end. Always, it is the motive that sings beneath the surface, he reflected as he strolled through the hotel's shaded paths. You silence her with lies, with clever words, with excuses, but still, she whispers, "Voilà, I am here." The whisper of motive was loudest in those who had resented Arlena's brilliance. She had been beautiful, radiantly, dangerously so, and with beauty came admiration, envy, and hatred. Poirot, with his profound understanding of human weakness, saw that her loveliness had been both gift and weapon. His first quiet inquiry of the morning was with Rosamond Darnley. She received him in a shaded corner of the terrace, sketchbook upon her lap, her manner outwardly serene. Yet Poirot, seating himself opposite, caught the slight stiffening of her shoulders. "You were friends of Madame Marshall?" Poirot asked gently. Rosamond lifted her eyes, calm and steady. "We were acquaintances of long standing." "Ah, but acquaintances, they do not look always with kindness, n'est-ce pas? You are a woman of grace, of refinement. To see another, dazzling, attracting all eyes, all compliments, does that not wound even a little?" She closed the sketchbook with quiet precision. "If you mean to suggest jealousy, Monsieur Poirot, you are mistaken." Poirot inclined his head, unoffended. Yet in his notebook, invisible to her, he wrote one word: pride. Pride wounded was often motive enough. From Rosamond he passed to Major Redfern. The soldier was pacing the lawn, his movements taut with suppressed energy. Poirot, strolling beside him, remarked casually, "Your wife, she is delicate, no? Sensitive." The Major's jaw tightened. "She has had a trying time. These events have been very upsetting." Poirot gave a little nod. "And before, when Madame Marshall walked upon the beach, drawing glances, admiration, such things, they are not easy for a wife." Redfern stopped short, eyes flashing. "If you're suggesting Christine bore any ill will towards Arlena—" "Calmes vous, mon capitaine," Poirot said softly. "I suggest nothing. I only observe. Jealousy, she is a passion more dangerous than hate. And she is a woman's motive, above all." The Major turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Poirot watching thoughtfully. It was not Christine's guilt that struck him in that moment, but her husband's fierce eagerness to protect her, even before an accusation had been made. Later, Poirot spoke briefly with the hotel proprietress, Mrs. Castle. She was a woman with sharp eyes, practical to the bone, who masked gossip as moral judgment. She was a flighty one, that Mrs. Marshall, she said disapprovingly. flaunting herself about. It was bound to end in trouble. "Indeed," murmured Poirot. "You believe, then, that she had enemies?" Mrs. Castle pursed her lips. "A woman like that makes enemies without even trying. Other women despised her. Men, well, men admired her too much." There, Poirot reflected, lay the essence. Alina Marshall had been at the center of a storm, drawing all eyes, awakening passions dangerous in their intensity. As the day wore on, Poirot withdrew to his quiet corner of the lounge, content to let the guests mill about with their anxieties. He had set the waters stirring, now the ripples spread. The contradictions of alibis weighed in one scale, the passions of motive in the other. "We are close now," he murmured. "The shadow of motive stretches across the bright sands. And when motive and opportunity meet," he raised a finger delicately. "Ah, then we have the murderer, revealed by his own heart." Chapter 9. The False Trail. For all his brilliance, Hercule Poirot never prided himself upon vast theories or dramatic conjectures. Instead, he cherished the small things, the tiny details others dismissed as insignificant. To him, they were the fingerprints of truth left behind by the careless hand of guilt. On that quiet morning, while others busied themselves with hushed conversations and furtive glances, Poirot busied himself with something quite different: shoes. He had noticed them the evening before, lined neatly in the corridor outside certain rooms. The hotel staff, with their particular methods, collected and polished them overnight. Most were ordinary, the practical footwear of holidaymakers. But one pair had struck him, delicate white sandals, worn and stained, placed outside Mrs. Redfern's door. It was not the shoes themselves that held his attention, but a faint smudge upon the sole, a greenish tint as though brushed with seaweed. Yet Mrs. Redfern, when questioned the day before, had sworn she never approached the cove where the murder occurred. "Aha," Poirot whispered to himself, bending with his customary neat precision. "Here we have the voice of truth, the leather, she does not lie as the lips may do." Still, Poirot was not hasty. He set the discovery aside, like a card placed discreetly at the bottom of the pack. He would not play it until the time was ripe. Instead, he took a turn through the gardens, and there encountered young Lionel Marshall. The boy was seated upon a bench, sketching roughly with a pencil. He looked up with nervous abruptness when Poirot greeted him. "You are an artist, perhaps?" Poirot asked kindly. "Not really," Lionel muttered. "It's just something to pass the time." Poirot leaned over the page. There, crudely outlined, was the little bay where Alina had died. And in the corner of the sketch, almost obscured, was a figure, drawn hastily, standing upon the rocks. "You saw someone there?" Poirot asked softly. Lionel flushed scarlet. "No, it's just a fancy. An idea." "Mon cher," Poirot said gently, "to draw what is not seen, that is imagination. But to draw with such detail, that is memory." The boy's hands trembled as he folded the sketchbook shut. "Please, Monsieur Poirot, don't tell my stepfather. He wouldn't like it." Poirot laid a fatherly hand upon his shoulder. "I tell no one, mon petit. But remember this, when you hide what you know, you give power to the guilty." The sketch, the sandals, each was but a fragment. Yet to Poirot, they formed a pattern. One detail remained, however, like the missing bead in a rosary, a woman's hat, found upon the sands by a chambermaid the morning after the crime. The hotel staff, dismissing it as lost property, had set it aside. Poirot, however, examined it with care. It was a wide-brimmed hat, plain but serviceable. And upon the ribbon, faintly clinging, was a single strand of auburn hair, the shade of Alina Marshall's flame-bright tresses. Poirot held it delicately between his fingers, his eyes shining. "So," he whispered, "the masquerade is almost complete. She was seen where she could not be, and not seen where she truly was. Voila! The piece that was out of place gives the whole away. He replaced the hat gently upon the table. The moment was not yet ripe for revelation. But in his mind's eye, the figure of the murderer had begun to emerge, sharp against the haze of confusion. Chapter 10. The Silent Witness. The summer hotel had grown restless, as though it shared in the nervous agitation of its guests. Laughter at breakfast was brittle, conversations clipped, and each face seemed turned slightly toward Hercule Poirot, as if waiting for him to lift the veil. Poirot, however, was in no haste. He strolled the terrace in his immaculate linen suit, hands folded behind his back, gaze resting upon the sea. His little grey cells were satisfied now. The last detail had clicked into place the previous evening. But satisfaction did not mean revelation. No, Poirot was a craftsman. And a craftsman knew the importance of timing. At luncheon, he was all charm. He complimented the chef on the soup de poisson, he admired the hydrangeas in the vase, he teased Lionel Marshall with a kindly word on his sketching. Yet beneath his geniality ran a quiet, deliberate purpose. He was watching, always watching, the twitch of a hand, the tightening of a jaw, the dart of an anxious glance. It was after the meal that he made his move. He called quietly upon Colonel Weston, the local chief constable, who had arrived the day before at Poirot's request. "You are ready, mon colonel?" Poirot asked in low tones. Weston gave a grim nod. "Ready as I'll ever be. Though I confess, Poirot, I can't make head nor tail of it. You say you've got your murderer pinned? I don't see how." "You will, my friend. For the moment, you must only do what I ask." And so, as the afternoon sun slanted across the lawns, a discreet summons went out. One by one, the principal guests were asked to gather in the drawing-room overlooking the gardens. They came reluctantly, suspiciously, Major Barry with his brusque manner, Mrs. Redfern pale and subdued, Mr. Redfern with restless eyes, Lionel with a guilty flush, and Mrs. Gardiner fluttering with indignant curiosity. Poirot entered last, his presence commanding silence at once. He placed himself by the mantel, his neat hands resting upon the marble. "My friends," he began smoothly, "we are assembled because the shadow of a crime lies upon this house. A woman is dead, and among us sits the one who caused her death. Do not be alarmed, I shall not denounce that person at this moment. Instead, I propose an experiment. A test, shall we say, of nerves." He allowed his gaze to travel over the company, his eyes lingering a fraction longer on two faces. "You will forgive me," he continued, "if I indulge in the little theatre. But I have found, in my long experience, that when the guilty are confronted with the image of their crime, they betray themselves. A gesture, a glance, a word too hastily spoken, it is enough." He raised a hand. At his signal, a constable entered, carrying something draped in a cloth. With great care, Poirot removed the covering. Upon the table lay the wide-brimmed hat, the one found upon the sands. There was a stir among the company. Mrs. Gardiner gave a little scream. Major Barry muttered something beneath his breath. Mrs. Redfern's hands, folded tightly in her lap, trembled almost imperceptibly. Poirot's voice was silken. "This hat, Mesdames et Messieurs, was worn by the woman seen walking near the cove at the hour of the crime. A woman with auburn hair." His fingers brushed the ribbon where the strands still clung. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the silence. "Consider, if you please. The murder was witnessed, or so it seemed. But what if the witness was deceived? What if what they saw was not the truth, but the semblance of truth? A substitution, a trick, a masquerade." His words fell like stones into water, sending ripples across every face in the room. Eyes darted, lips pressed tight, and in one corner, the faintest gasp escaped before it was hastily stifled. Poirot, Quick as lightning, noted the source. He smiled very gently. Ah, he murmured, the little trap, she begins to close. He made no further accusation then. Instead, he dismissed them with a courteous bow, saying only that he would speak more in the morning. But when the drawing-room emptied, and Poirot remained alone with Colonel Weston, the Englishman demanded in frustration. "Good Lord, Poirot, why didn't you strike while the iron was hot? You had them on edge, you saw it yourself, that reaction." Poirot straightened his tie with fastidious calm. "Patience, mon ami. Tonight, I lay the snare. Tomorrow, the bird shall flutter straight into it." And with that, he left the room, humming softly to himself, while the shadow of guilt deepened inexorably over one trembling soul. Chapter 11. The last act approaches. That evening, the atmosphere in the hotel was thick with tension. Dinner was a subdued affair. Silver cutlery clinked against china, yet conversation stalled in half-finished sentences. Each guest seemed to carry a private burden, a restless fear, as though the very walls had absorbed Poirot's words and whispered them back with sinister emphasis. Poirot, for his part, dined lightly, his manner serene. He praised the lobster thermidor, declined wine with a courteous shake of the head, and appeared wholly absorbed in the angle of a candle's flame. Yet beneath his placid exterior, the little grey cells were whirring with perfect precision. He had cast the bait, and now he watched the water for the telltale ripple. After the meal, he withdrew to the lounge where the lamps glowed mellow in the corners, and the sea's murmur drifted faintly through open windows. One by one, the guests found excuses to drift near him, some with curiosity, others with nervous bravado. Poirot welcomed them all with the same old-world courtesy, but his sharp eyes never ceased their quiet probing. At 9:30, Colonel Weston joined him, looking grim. "They're unsettled, Poirot. You've got them half mad with speculation. But I confess, I still can't tell which way you're pointing." Poirot's moustaches twitched in amusement. "That, my friend, is because I do not point, I guide. The truth, she is like a bird that hides in the hedge. One must coax her gently into the open." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "There were 4 points, mon colonel, that betrayed the culprit to me. 4 only, yet they were enough. You saw one of them yourself this afternoon." Weston frowned. "You mean the reaction to the hat?" Poirot inclined his head. "Precisely. Guilt, it cannot disguise itself entirely. It will leak, like the water through a badly patched roof." As if to illustrate his words, the door opened, and Mrs. Redfern entered. She looked pale, drawn, her eyes shadowed. She hesitated upon seeing Poirot, then moved forward with a kind of desperate resolution. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "may I speak with you a moment, in private?" Poirot rose at once, bowing slightly. "But of course, madam." Weston made to leave, but Poirot stayed him with a gesture. "No, no, mon ami, remain. For what Madame Redfern has to say may concern us both." Mrs. Redfern faltered, colour rising to her cheeks. "It is only, this afternoon, when you spoke, I thought you looked at me. And I cannot bear it. I swear to you, I had nothing to do with that woman's death. Nothing. I may have disliked her, I had cause, but murder? No, monsieur, never." Poirot regarded her gently, his eyes kind but unreadable. "Madam, I do not accuse. I observe. The truth, she is still in the shadows. But take comfort, the innocent, they have nothing to fear from Hercule Poirot." She shivered, murmured a faint word of thanks, and left as abruptly as she had come. Colonel Weston exhaled sharply. "She's frightened out of her wits. And she's not the only one. You've got them all on edge, Poirot. By heaven, if you don't end this soon, they'll be tearing each other to pieces." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Yes, they are restless. That is well. For the criminal, he thrives on calm, on the silence where suspicion sleeps. But when nerves fray, when fear creeps in, the guilty hand trembles. It is then, mon ami, that the truth betrays itself. He stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. Tomorrow, at 10 o'clock, I shall call them all together once more. And then, Colonel, the little drama will reach its last act. That night, the hotel seemed unable to rest. Doors opened and closed along the corridor, hushed voices murmured behind thin walls. A shadow lingered too long upon the staircase before melting into the dark. And in his room, Hercule Poirot sat serenely polishing his patent leather shoes, his eyes bright with anticipation. The net was drawn, the circle closed. Tomorrow, the murderer would stand revealed. Chapter 12. The Final Curtain. Morning dawned clear over the Cornish coast, the sea glittering with deceptive calm. Inside the grand lounge of the Pendlebury estate, however, there was none of that serenity. Every guest had been summoned by Hercule Poirot, who stood immaculately dressed, moustache gleaming, and manner calm but electric with purpose. They gathered in uneasy silence, Lady Pembroke pale and stiff in her pearls, Sir Reginald slumped in his chair, avoiding all eyes, Mr. Oliver fidgeting with his walking stick, Miss Lydia composed, though her hand trembled as she smoothed her skirt, and at the edge of the room, young Arthur, pale but defiant. Inspector Graves was present as well, arms crossed, bracing for the denouement. Poirot began softly, his voice carrying with deliberate clarity. Mesdames et messieurs, the time has come. You are all anxious, no? You wish to know who among you struck down the unfortunate Lady Pembroke's maid, who stole the jewels, who dared disturb the harmony of this elegant house. Very well. I shall tell you. But you will allow me first to explain how we arrive at the truth. Order and method, always. He paced lightly across the rug, every eye following him. First, consider the jewels. They were not taken by an opportunistic thief from outside. Non. The theft was staged to appear so. Only one within this circle could have engineered it, for only you had the opportunity. Sir Reginald let out a grunt. Nonsense. Could have been a servant. Poirot raised a finger. Ah, but no. The servants were cleared. Each accounted for at the time. No, it is among you. He turned, addressing them in order, as though assembling pieces on a chessboard. Lady Pembroke, your jewels were insured, were they not? It would not be the first time a noble lady staged a theft to claim money. She gasped, indignation rising, but Poirot smiled gently. No, do not protest. I knew you were innocent from the first, because your vanity, madam, is too great. You would never part with jewels that displayed so well against your neck. A murmur rippled through the room. Poirot continued. Mr. Oliver, the failed investor. You, too, had motive, debts pressing, a need for sudden fortune. Yet you are clumsy, my friend. You lack finesse. The careful placing of false clues, such as the handkerchief by the window, was not your style. Mr. Oliver reddened and muttered, Well, I never. Poirot went on smoothly. Miss Lydia, beautiful and ambitious. Your motive, also, could be imagined, to secure wealth quickly, to free yourself from dependence. But you, mademoiselle, are too clever to have left behind the footprints in the rose bed. No, you are ruled out. At this, Miss Lydia's eyes flickered, relief, or something else. Poirot made a note in his little grey cells. Now, Sir Reginald. Poirot's voice sharpened. You are a man who lives beyond his means, yes? Your estate crumbles, your creditors whisper. To stage a theft, to deflect suspicion, and perhaps sell jewels abroad, it would fit. But alas, your movements that night were too well observed. You drank heavily. You could not have executed so neat a crime without betraying yourself. Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Poirot stopped pacing. He turned to face the last suspect, Arthur. "Which leaves you, mon cher Arthur." The young man stiffened. "That's ridiculous. I had no reason to." Poirot raised a hand. "No reason? Ah, but you had every reason. You are Lady Pembroke's nephew, are you not? Supposed to inherit one day, but not soon enough for your liking. You were in debt from gambling, OUI? Your creditors pressed hard. The theft of the jewels would solve your problem in one stroke. But then, Poirot's voice grew grave. The maid, poor girl, saw you in the act. And so, you silenced her." Arthur's face turned chalk white. "That's a lie." Poirot advanced, his eyes glittering. "None. It is the truth. I observed the mud on your shoes, mud that matched the rose bed beneath the window, though you claimed you had not been there. I noticed the faint perfume on your cuff, not from Miss Lydia, as you tried to imply, but from the maid who wore it that evening. And most damning, when I asked about the missing key to the jewel cabinet, you answered too quickly, before anyone else had mentioned it was missing. You could only know that if you had taken it yourself." The room gasped. Arthur stammered, eyes darting wildly. Poirot's voice softened but struck like steel. "It was the psychology, you see. When accused, the innocent protest with outrage or calm reason. You, Arthur, grew pale, your eyes flickered, your lips pressed tight. It was the reaction of the guilty, the man whose act has been uncovered." Arthur suddenly leapt to his feet. "You can't prove it. You've no evidence." Inspector Graves moved forward. "We've enough. Poirot's given us more than enough. Arthur Pembroke, you're under arrest for theft and murder." Arthur tried to dart for the door, but Graves and another constable were faster. In moments, the young man was restrained, shouting curses that rang hollow in the grand hall. Silence followed, heavy and breathless. Poirot smoothed his moustache, his expression grave. Evil, Miss Amos, is often found under the sun, shining upon fair faces, hidden beneath charming manners. But it cannot escape the little grey cells. Lady Pembroke sat, trembling. "My own nephew. How could he?" Poirot inclined his head. "Because greed blinds, madam. Because ambition corrodes. In the end, the motive is always the oldest of all, Argent. Money." The group dispersed slowly, shaken. Poirot stood by the great window, looking out at the glittering sea. His eyes were distant, reflective. The sun shines, the waves sparkle, and yet, beneath the beauty, there is darkness. Such is the nature of mankind. But order, at least, is restored. And that, I think, is enough. And so, under the moonlight, another mystery is brought to its close. Thank you for joining me here on Moonlight Audiobook. No matter where in the world you are listening from, I'm grateful you chose to spend your time here. If you enjoyed this journey with Hercule Poirot, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow lovers of mystery. Until next time, may the night always keep its secrets.